Hello and welcome back to our Hopkins at Home mini course on the history of fake news from the flood to the apocalypse. We're on to part three, patriotic mythologies, as I've called it. That is to say, finding ancient, and I use that term in air quotes, ancient fakes in the Renaissance. So we're moving from the pagan world through the Christian world and the sorting out of sacred history, now to the period of the Renaissance, of the revival of ancient Greco-Roman culture, and the reinvention, the creative patriotic reinvention of the origins of the great kingdoms and principalities and cultural centers of Europe. And I'll begin with a setup piece on what I call Me First. That is to say, it's a melange of thoughts about the nature of forgery, what I call hyper-diffusionism and hyperlocationism, which are a couple of forces, or a few forces that combine to describe a lot of the patriotic mythologies that are invented in the Renaissance to justify the way the world has become since the ancient period. Well, what is hyperdiffusionism? Well, it's funny. In the study of forgery, it is sometimes useful to use debunked historical theories, which nonetheless seem accurately to describe the phenomenon going on in the world of forgery. One of those is a late 19th, early 20th century European theory of historians and social scientists called hyperdiffusionism. That is, the theory that particular cultural phenomena and cultural technologies started with a single and very often a kind of golden age culture. And that is the origin point that explains why various cultural phenomena occur in different cultures at different times over history. So in other words, there is an culture that gradually spreads out in different places at different times to sort of enlighten the world. This theory was often used to promote Eurocentric and even racist narratives of white Anglo-Saxon cultural superiority that have long since been passed over. Sir Grafton Elliott Smith, the distinguished historian in Britain in the late 19th, early 20th century, described a version of hyperdiffusionism which he called the heliocentric culture complex. And he has a kind of a map here. Heliolithic cultural complex, I should say. What is that? Well, helio and lithic. It is, on the one hand, cultures that worship the sun. Here we have an image of an ancient Egyptian cultural icon of the sun. And lithic, that is to say, gigantic stones and stone edifices that were erected by these ancient cultures. Egypt, for Sir Grafton, is the ultimate example of the origin of a hyperdiffusion of culture. Now here you'll see, for example, the dotted circle on your screen, that's Egypt, and then the arrows pointing, diffusing outwards into the rest of the world in kind of single arrows, single directional transformations, both in Europe, in the rest of the African continent, to the Indian subcontinent, out to the Pacific, and ultimately to Mexico, passing east from Egypt, not west. Hyperdiffusionism tends to rely on gaps, much as forgery fills gaps very, very usefully. Hyperdiffusionists rely on gaps between demonstrable, historical, and contextual information, thus megaliths, but especially those that lack inscriptions and textual evidence. Hyperdiffusionists also tend to shy away from causational evidence. For example, established cross-cultural trade routes, linguistic derivations and adaptations, or demonstrable modes of textual transmission. Hyperdiffusionists kind of just look at patterns without following precise levels and degrees and directions of transmission. Much as forgers rely upon one filling in the gaps from a limited amount of evidence through their forgery to make broad conclusions that link diffuse or disparate elements of the distant past into a single kind of resolved theory. So, for example, the pyramids. Here are the pyramids of Egypt in this Heliolithic culture that I've just described according to this theory. But then at some point you also get these Mayan stepped pyramids in Central America, Mexico, as well as in Cambodia. These are cultures that are demonstrably later, according to the archaeological record, but in a hyper-diffusionist perspective, there was Egypt and then there was everybody else. And if we go back to our first lecture, perhaps the Egyptian pyramids were themselves brought as technologies by aliens, for all we know. There's a hyper-diffusion theory that even Sir Grafton Elliott and others could not have anticipated before the age of the rocket. Now, here is an example of that map. But of course, these arrows that you see in the hyper-diffusionist theory map that I just showed you, if you compare that to actual trade route maps, for example, of Mesopotamia here, there are no one-directional arrows. Trade routes go in multiple directions and often overlap. Cultural transmission and diffusion are incredibly complicated phenomena. They are not simple phenomena with a beginning point and an end point. But forgers really neatly wish to create endpoints, to neat beginning points, to make arguments for the transmissions of culture. A good example of this in American history, actually, is Bat Creek Stone. It's this small fragment that you see in front of you. It is an inscribed stone collected in 1889 from a Native American burial mound excavation undertaken in Tennessee by the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology Mound Survey. This is actually hyperdiffusion at work in archaeological forgery. Now, when it was found, the excavators believed it may have been some kind of inscribed stone based on the language of the alphabet invented for the Cherokee language by Sequoyah in around the year 1821. The only way you could explain this thing in 1889 is because, of course, there was not a written alphabetic language of the Cherokee prior to Sequoyah, that it must have been some kind of Sequoian inscription. Okay. Well, and here you'll see a close-up of how that was developed. In 1970, an ancient Semitic scholar proposed that the letters were actually not based on Sequoyah, but actually were ancient Paleo-Hebrew, dating from perhaps the time of Christ and the apostles, around the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian Common Era, proving, in a sense, possibly or ostensibly, that there was an ancient pre-Columbian, pre-Columbus discovering America, hyperdiffusion from Europe to the New World. This invoked a theory that was sometimes espoused that actually the Native Americans who were not explicable before Columbus or even after Columbus's discovery, one theory was that they were members of one of the lost tribes of Israel. So Bat Creek Stone, looked at after, almost 100 years after its excavation, seen by some scholars as possibly evidence that the Native Americans were connected to the ancient Judeo-Christian tradition. And pointing partly in evidence to this, an ancient Jewish coin demonstrating a similar version of the inscription. How in the world did that get into Tennessee and the Appalachian world? Debate about this went on for decades until Hopkins' own Kyle McCarter in the Department of Near Eastern Languages published some useful scholarship demonstrating that it is indeed a forgery, and likely one promulgated by the Smithsonian excavators in 1889, who may have had some knowledge of biblical era Hebrew writing and wished for some reason or another to plant this to be discovered later and indeed set off a firestorm of debate, as indeed it did. There's an example of a imposture, a forged hyperdiffusionary piece of evidence, improbably found, but seeming to suggest an otherwise fantastic outcome or theoretical resolution. And you can go see this at a museum near where it was discovered. Now, hyperdiffusion emerges in the late Middle Ages and in the Renaissance through a desire to prove what I call early adopter syndrome. We've talked about this a little bit so far. So the idea that the moral greatness, the genius, the native richness of a land is in part proven by the antiquity of its adoption of Christianity. So this did not happen in Great Britain until about the early 12th century, when the narrative was created that Joseph of Arimathea, actually, after burying Christ, he took possession of Christ's body from Pontius Pilate, collected his blood and sweat in vessels, which become associated with the Holy Grail, and buries Christ, and then goes on a boat and floats all the way to Great Britain, indeed to Glastonbury. And so here you see an image of Glastonbury Cathedral. This story of Glastonbury, England, being the landing point of Christianity, the first point of Christianity in biblical antiquity, started in the 12th century when Glastonbury Abbey burned down. It was then that the monks decided to embellish an existing account of the history of Glastonbury. William of Malmesbury's On the Antiquity of the Church, in which they interpolate a piece stating that Joseph of Arimathea was indeed this bearer of Christianity, a kind of hyper-diffusionary force to attract pilgrims back to the site, which creates a kind of hyperlocational endpoint for this hyper-diffusion that occurred at some impossibly remote period in history. You go to Glastonbury, you can see a nice stained glass window suggesting this very thing. The Glastonbury monks made this up because they were worried about pilgrims not coming to their church. You need to have reasons for pilgrims to come. What better thing than to establish that actually you should come there because that's where Christianity began in Great Britain. Furthermore, just to sort of gild that lily, they also apparently discovered the bodies of King Arthur and Guinevere. And indeed, the Joseph's vessel containing Christ's sweat and blood, the Holy Grail itself. And these, in different forms, are interpolated into medieval texts by these monks to embellish the reputation of Glastonbury. This became popularized in verse adaptations of the story, modeled partly on one of those apocryphal gospels that we talked about last time, the apocryphal gospel of Nicodemus and the so-called Acts of Pontius Pilate. These were picked up subsequently, so forgery has a way of gathering steam over time. This was picked up by the 14th century chronicler John of Glastonbury, of Glastonbury, who later claimed King Arthur a descendant of King Arimathea, and the story went on. And thus, we have William Blake imagining in this image Joseph of Arimathea wandering along the rocks of Albion in most deepest, darkest classical or biblical antiquity. We have medieval and Renaissance scholars imagining Merlin and indeed King Arthur himself. Here is an image of the Knights of the Round Table. There's Arthur to the right in the background, and they're augmented by the History Channel's technology. This perfectly respectable medieval illumination is made to glow to inspire wonder. And this is, of course, a central aspect of the myth of King Arthur, which we have in our Bibliotheca Fictiva collection in any number of versions in Renaissance and medieval texts in earliest printed forms. Also, we know about these through film. Indeed, Indiana Jones and the Quest for the Holy Grail of 1989 focuses in on this mythical story. According to that version of events, the Grail was finally discovered, much as we talked about before. The Ten Commandments had been discovered and the Raiders of the Lost Ark and stored in a factory, a warehouse somewhere in the United States of America. So too, according to the Indiana Jones story of The Last Crusade, the evil Nazi archaeologists Elsa and Donovan discover the Grail. The ancient temple, which happens to be the temple of the monastery at Petra, begins to crumble and it all falls into an abyss. Playing on a very famous myth. This is now the stuff of legend, of film, and indeed of action figure lore. But this is all designed to set up the two remaining sections of our discussion today, which is the making up of foundation stories, of urban foundation myths, as it were, in the Renaissance, particularly through fake archaeology and the invention of texts, what I call walking in the footsteps of Noah, that incredibly useful moment for the forger who loves gaps in history that is, the period between the receding of the waters of the flood after the destruction of the world and everything that came after. The greatest figure in the Renaissance, what I call the arch forger, about whom one of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins, Walter Stevens, in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, is the great expert, actually. Annius of Viterbo decided to invent a story for his own hometown of Viterbo, Italy, as actually being the epicenter of Noah's post-Diluvian international imperial greatness. He begins, in part, by elaborating this theory by discovering archaeologically the forged epigraphic fragment you see before you, which is ridiculously written in a Beneventan script, a manuscript scribal form that exists in no other epigraphic fragments. It only exists in manuscripts. But it's a very difficult hand to read and specific to only a couple monasteries in Italy. So it's a little elusive, not unlike our elusive Bat Creek cave inscription that I just talked about. This object professes to be a decree inscribed in impossible early medieval Italy, and possibly early, around the year 786, by the Lombard king Desiderius, confirming the hegemony in Etruria of the ancient Etruscans of several settlements, including, not surprisingly, Annius of Viterbo's own home of Viterbo, Italy, or as it's called in Latin, Vetulonia. This is augmented by yet another archaeological find, a eureka moment by Annius of Viterbo, this ancient hieroglyph, the Tabula Osiriana, which is entirely a fabrication made up of medieval and modern elements, and is supposed to actually look like an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph. Of course, remember that we weren't able to read hieroglyphs when this was created in the last decade of the 15th century. We wouldn't indeed for another 300 years or so. Nonetheless, it's a very exciting thing to find because, among other things, it records the fact that in Viterbo, Italy, this notice was placed, this great table, this tabula, describing the liberation of Italy by Osiris and the killing of all the giants, and the cultivation of grapes, which is how you civilize a land according to ancient lore, around the year 1700 BCE. Annius discovers this hieroglyph, which he, of course, fashions in the manner of literary sources that describe how the ancients, including the ancient Egyptians, would erect these stelae, or these tables to tell people about momentous things that happened. Think of those historical markers on the highway. This is taken by Annius, this rather absurd object, is taken by Annius as proof, as evidence of the so-called Prisca Theologia, the idea of the first ancient religion, which is a single religion that is all informed fundamentally by a Judeo-Christian perspective of monotheism. Thus, even the Egyptians were Christian, they just didn't know it yet. And that actually Viterbo is, and everything else that comes from after the flood comes from Noah, and the Egyptians are all later. The Greeks are all later. It's actually Viterbo is Noachian. It goes back to the beginning of the resettlement of the earth. Thus, Osiris, who is celebrated as a kind of civilizing hero, even in the ancient author Diodorus Siculus, made Viterbo the seat of an ancient Etruscan empire, subsequently developed into the epicenter of human culture. The most important aspect of this absurd farce or forgery is that it makes the Viterbans, the Italians, more ancient than the Greeks. And this is a point of contention and of some consternation in Renaissance Italy, which places all great authority in something's antiquity. If the Italians are newcomers and the Greeks are ancient, then the Italians must be inferior to the Greeks, but this elevates them to a new position. This lore on this Tabula Osiriana and in the Decretum of Desiderius are even more ancient than the epics of Homer. Here is a later painting of Annius of Viterbo. We don't actually know what he looked like, writing his forgeries, because not only did he create these false archaeological finds that are quite useful in creating the larger narrative of Viterban precedents, but he also invents a sequence of texts, ancient manuscript texts, which he wrote down after having discovered them in a temporary encounter with the manuscript, which unfortunately was no longer accessible. This is another story that often shows up in forgery. And then he wrote a learned commentary on each of these ancient texts. So here you have the book on the right, which is in the Bibliotheca Fictiva in the first edition in 1498. And here you see a map in that same page of Rome, and prominently the Vicus Tuscus, or the Etruscan road, in a sense where all the most ancient and learned Etruscans live. In the painting, you'll see two books clearly identified, in Ganesum and in Barosum, which are presumably Annius's commentaries on the book of Genesis and Berosus of Chaldea's Babyloniaca. So, in other words, Annius is commenting on the origin texts, those texts most concerned with the origins of the world. He does so, of course, because he wants to put Viterbo as close to the origins of the world as he possibly can. In the printed version, you'll see that he creates a whole sequence of texts, some by identified, already known authors whose texts were lost, in other cases, invented ones. He creates Megasthenes, the Persian, Manetho, the Egyptian, and Berosus of Chaldea, who we know is a recorded historian in Diodorus Siculus. He also throws in some Greeks, Xenophon, Archilochus, and some Romans, Cato the Elder, Fabius Maximus, and Sempronius, and tosses in at least one Alexandrian Jew, Philo, to kind of mix things up and to create this wonderful melange of texts, all of which fill in the gaps, as it were, of ancient history to promote his narrative of Viterban preeminence. And so here you'll see the text of the antiquities that were supposedly found. On the left, with the red box, is the so-called original text that he had discovered in this manuscript. And then on the right are his learned commentaries in smaller type. So he's what he really has done is invented the commentary, as it were, first, and then generates the original text, which he presumably finds, which promote the narrative that he has in mind. The narrative constructed primarily through the commentary. What a brilliant idea to discover incredible things and then to make incredibly learned commentaries where you're quoting across all the great works of ancient knowledge, whether they be false or true, in order to prove your point. On the right is the commentary. Now, all of this, of course, geographically and intellectually has to do with that idea of the repopulation of the earth. Our course is, after all, dedicated to the history of fake news from the flood to the apocalypse, with emphasis, of course, on the flood. Here you have a medieval image and illumination of this imagination that we've talked about earlier of the post-Diluvian world, with the Noah's Ark on the mountaintop in Armenia, and the distribution of the responsibility to repopulate the earth handed out to the sons of Noah. Shem on the top is the settler of Asia and the Near East, as you can see here. Here is Ham, the cursed one, who looked upon the nakedness of his father, who has to settle Africa, and then Japheth, who is the founder of Europe. And according to Annius of Viterbo, Japheth, the last of those, ends up, along with Noah, in where the red star is, Viterbo, Italy, just north of the city of Rome, where, incidentally, the popes of Rome kept their summer palaces. In his fanciful text, Annius generates the story, particularly from Berosus of Chaldea, that Noah left Armenia in the year 100, so 100 years after the landing of the ark after the flood, and traveled with his family, founding the Noachian colonies of the Mediterranean, primarily through his son Japheth, whose genealogical tree appears before you from the Antiquities, volume 1498 in the Bibliotheca Fictiva. You can see the name of Japheth at the upper portion of the page, and then also in the left corner. And then from these are the descendants who are linked in our copy with manuscript connectors. It seems like the great-great-grandson or so of Japheth is Tubal, who is the inventor of music, where we get the word tuba, I believe. And so the inventors of things. So in 108, Noah sails up the Tiber and founds the city of Rome on the Janiculum Hill. Rome, or Janiculum, the name for that hill, derives from something which is very useful to Annius of Viterbo, the use of onomastics. So onomastics are creative genealogical arguments for the relationship between places and the people they presumably were first populated by. So one of the names, one of the cognomens, as it were, of Noah is Janus, after the Hebrew word for the inventor of wine, one of the things that Noah was, as a civilizing settler of lands. Thus, the Janiculum, or the city of Rome, was founded by Janus, that is to say, Noah, in the repopulation of the earth. Japheth then takes that work and fills the rest of Italy. This comes, of course, after the Osiris and the others. So it's all this kind of inevitable, inexorable shift of the history of the world and its orientation to Viterbo, Italy. And also, another useful thing for Annius is that the Etruscan language, which survives textually in very few examples, is difficult to read. It almost has kind of runic qualities, and he capitalizes on that and explains that it's just simply further evidence of his theory. That is, that the ancient Etruscan writing, such as it exists in small amounts in inscriptions on stone, is simply a vernacularized version of Hebrew, coming from Noah and Japheth and others in the resettlement of the world. Problem solved. So the point of all this, as I mentioned earlier, is to create the precedence of Italians over the Greeks. What they would call this phrase, Graecia mendax, those mendacious Greeks who tried to lie and pervert the history of the world by arguing that they were the first major Western post-biblical culture. No, according to Annius, it was the Etruscans, who were even more ancient than the Greeks, who of course lived in Etruria, part of which is Viterbo. And so you have these hieroglyphs discovered archaeologically along with this inscription, and you have these invented texts and their commentaries, which combine to create the mess, the Babelic confusion of Annius of Viterbo's mythic creation of the story of the epicenter of the Noachian universe, that is Viterbo. The damage done is really incredible. Annius, his text first appeared in 1498 and gets reprinted over and over again. We have over 27 editions of Annius's works and Annian commentaries, both pro and against, his imitators as well as his critics, which span in a period of about 150 years, from about the year 1500 to the middle of the 17th century. Many different cultures, the French, the Swedes, the English, all take up this sort of Annian system of reinvention, of mythic urban foundation, and turn the French into the earliest cultures, the English and so forth, not unlike that hyper-diffusionary theory of the first adopters of Christianity, only it's here applied on an even larger level to the pre-Christian, indeed to the Noachian worlds. Indeed, one of the later books written in the tradition of Annius's Babelic confusion is this text on the right, A Restitution of Decayed Intelligence, in which an English Catholic exile living in Antwerp tries to make the argument that actually Christianity, Roman Catholicism was also an early adoption within England, and that England, which had become Protestant permanently under Queen Elizabeth should return to the true religion of the Catholic faith. And it's not strange, perhaps, that in this Babelic confusion of 150 years of credulous quotation and copying of Annius's method, from the Tower of Babel to the Flood to Noah and beyond, that the title page of such an image of a book would itself have an image of the Tower of Babel associated here with this concept of nationum origo, of the origins of nations, which is precisely what Annius is doing. He's taking the period of the dispersal and the confusion of languages after the Babelic confusion is inspired to create a kind of perfect synthesis of all human history with evidence that proves that it was all leading inexorably from specific moments of the ancient past to the great moment of the settlement of Italy as the first culture, with Viterbo as its capital. In the last section of our class, we can look at what is a much, in some ways, cleaner and clearer version of this idea of archaeological fakery and mythic foundation tomfoolery that we've been discussing. And it comes from one of the most beautiful books printed in the 17th century, which we have in our collection, Curzio Inghirami's very famous treatise on the Etruscan antiquities. He's building from Annius's foundations about 120 years or so after Annius's book comes out, and invents his scheme of time capsules, the so-called scariths of Scornello. So here is an image of the very young Curzio Inghirami, a minor nobleman from the city, a nearby Tuscan city, not far from Viterbo, really, of Volterra. And the young Curzio decides he's going to make quite a distinguished history for his estate just outside of the city of Volterra, in his estate called Scornello. And just as Annius of Viterbo wants to invent a distinguished uber history and genealogy for the city of Viterbo, so does our friend Curzio wish to create a very specific and distinguished genealogical story of the direct descent of himself and his family from the ancient figures of deepest, darkest antiquity. He does this not by digging up a couple of hieroglyphs and medieval inscriptions, but rather these remarkable time capsules filled with ancient Etruscan manuscripts. He built these from bitumen and wax and hair, and hid inside of them, as it were, ancient texts, which he then buried and then subsequently went on excavations with friends and, say, witnesses, and discovered. As he opened them up, they began to reveal a story which he felt compelled to tell in this remarkable, beautiful folio volume, sumptuously illustrated with, air quotes, facsimiles, not only of the actual physical time capsules, but the manuscripts that he found within them. In this beautiful book, there's also a wonderful map, a map of the ancient city of Volterra in the moments of its early greatness. You see colosseums, you see temples, amphitheaters, obelisks, and other signs of an incredible, rich, and thriving city, precisely because Volterra was supposed to be that in the times of the ancient Etrurians. Indeed, if you walk the ramparts of Volterra today, you can see where Curzio is coming up with some of these ideas. There are elements and remnants of ancient Roman antiquity, modeled after ancient Greek architectural and cultural and civic edifices. There, in a sense, the ramparts of Volterra inspire this imagination, perhaps, of great ancient origins, even greater than could possibly be known up to that point. So you have all these wonderful images of, there's an amphitheater on the upper right-hand corner, for example. Perhaps that's the theater that you see below. You can even walk through one of the famous gates in Volterra and be inspired by the monumental architecture and indeed the monumental sculpture of these presumed ancient Etruscan ancestors who predate the Greeks. Here's an engraving of the same gate with the heads as they're supposed to have been, to have looked versus how they look now, these gigantic images of sort of guardians of an ancient city. So here you have the ancient city, and then here you have the much reduced sort of post-antiquity version of Volterra as it is in Curzio's own day. It's a pale imitation, as it were, of the ancient greatness. But there are real remnants living and breathing, as it were, from that ancient time, and those are his ancestors, Curzio's immediate ancestors, in his farm and his estate at Scornello. Here's a photograph of the estate, and here I've circled the kind of the boundaries of the estate as it appears in the map in Curzio's book. There's actually outbuildings at Villa. This is the Villa Scornello itself as well that survive in Volterra. And here, at the center of the estate, or the upper corner of the estate, I should say, is the citadel of Prospero, the home and the seat of many of the scariths that Curzio would find. What is the citadel of Prospero? Well, it is nothing other than the font from which grew the great family tree of Curzio Inghirami himself. As you can see on the right, a gigantic, elaborately etched, fold-out family tree of Curzio, rising out of the earth, as it were, from the water and the nutrients of this great epicenter of Etruscan culture to flourish through the centuries up to Curzio's own moment. Whereas Viterbo has an ancient genealogy descending from Noah and Japheth for the entire city, Curzio Inghirami has for his family, the family of the Inghirami, a minor noble family, one of the greatest family trees, personal family trees in all of human history. Growing here from you can see De Inghirami at the bottom, and then moving all the way up with all the elaborate armorials of this great family tree, this genealogy, the ultimate genealogy in some ways that one could imagine for an Italian in the Renaissance. And then you have these images, not only of the time capsules, but of the manuscripts within. And they're even sort of inscribed at odd angles to make them look like they're real manuscripts. In fact, they're forgeries. And what do these tell? Well, they are from, after all, the citadel of Prospero. So here, imagine, high atop the lonely Volterran hill of Scornello. The wind is blowing, as you can see in this fanciful romantic image. There, at the middle of this romantic scene, we see the last of the great Etruscan priests, about to be wiped out by the new coming Roman invaders, Prospero of Fiesole, who prophesies the future of what is to come next. And what is to come next? According to this, cave, 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 as the text says, beware, 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 Prospero of Fiesole, and says, and so forth and so on. Among other things, that there will come the prophesied king of the Jews. Remember, this is pre-Christian Etrurian prophecy. And the coming of a great king after whom the years shall be numbered. So think here, the fact that we do indeed have a renumbered chronology after the pagan world. It is defined by before and after Christ, the time, the purported birth time of Christ, which is the year 0. Everything about the title page of this book is wrong. It almost seems like a total tongue-in-cheek activity, and yet Curzio Inghirami was really quite serious and extremely applied in his effort here. The Etruscarum, Antiquitatum, Fragmenta. This is neither Etruscan, nor is it ancient, nor are these true fragments of anything other than Curzio Inghirami's imagination. As we go through, the title page further says below that it was published in Frankfurt. That is a false location. This was not printed in Frankfurt. This was printed in Florence. And we know that from internal evidence of the text. We see 2 dates given One, the year of our Lord, 1637. That is the time that Prospero predicted that would be renumbered after the coming of Christ. For our purposes, Curzio also supplies us with the true Etruscan date, which is 4495. So there's a certain play at work here, even on the title page, about the sort of celebration of this Etruscan living myth. And even the printer's device itself is fake. It's not a commercial logo for a printer in Frankfurt, but rather it's an invented Etruscan emblem, which you can find elsewhere in the book, planted in the text as contained in one of the many scores of scariths whose contents Curzio transcribes and expresses throughout this rather large folio volume. So in scarith number 56, as you can see on the far upper right-hand corner, in the 20th of September and so forth and so on, when he found it in 1635, he finds this inscription or this drawing, this image, which is the sign of Volterra itself. And you can see parallels of it on inscribed on other pieces in amongst the scariths of Scornello, even elements of it in coins that he supposedly found or that he can use to corroborate the fictions that he's created in his manuscript scariths. You see wonderful facsimiles of inscribed stone as well as paper, and difficult to read Etruscan letter forms as well. Very useful to Curzio as much as to Annius of Viterbo. It is somebody with the talent of Curzio Inghirami who can transcribe and express the true contents of these texts for the world. Now, this blew up a firestorm of debate, and there are scores of texts which challenge it. We have almost all of them in the collection, including all of which, by the way, inspired Curzio not to quiet down, but actually to publish a 1,000-page defense of his own forgery. This is an incredible thing to think about, that not only did he fashion this entire universe of things, but he had the goal to write a defense of it. Very little work has been done on the Discorso di Curzio, in part because there are only about a dozen copies of this book that survive. There are 2 copies, including this one, with unique manuscript inscriptions in the Biblioteca Fictiva. I recently, when we taught our graduate course, Professor Walter Stevens and myself, on what we call literature and truth to PhD students, one of our students actually wrote her essay on portions of this text. So we're now beginning to crack this text at Hopkins using our collection. Now, there is a great irony here. You can read a wonderful book about all of this. That was, it's called The Scariths of Scornello by Ingrid Rowland. It's easily orderable, and it's a wonderful read if you want to get more into this. There's also a copy of a digital copy of the entire book, the original illustrated book online, which I will send you all a link to in an email. But about 200 years ago, Curzio, long after Curzio had died, his dreams came true. That is to say, they found near Scornello ancient Etruscan tombs of incredible richness. You can see the contents of those next time you go to Italy, because the Archaeological Museum in Florence has a special urban villa garden courtyard that contains the remnants of these cave discoveries of Scornello from about 200 years ago. Here they've created a sort of faux cave entrance in this garden at the Archaeological Museum, so you can kind of imagine yourself experiencing walking into one of these caves wherein are maintained the funeral sarcophagi, these beautiful, elaborate, real sarcophagi that were discovered in Volterra, created by what you might think even to be Inghirami's imagined Etruscan ancestors, the Volterran Etruscans themselves. Sometimes truth can be stranger indeed than fiction. All of this discovered very close, as it were, as it happens, to Prospero's citadel. And so we're reminded once again, caveat lector. Before you walk into any cave or find in the roots systems of complex old ancient trees, little scarus that you crack open and discover lost Etruscan writing, remember that so much of this is us in latter centuries populating the world with our imagined versions of the truth. It's not a small irony that if you hold up some of these manuscript survivals of Curzio's forgeries and you hold them up to the light, you can see a watermark to the paper factory just down the street from where Curzio lived and breathed in the 17th century. Again, caveat lector. Thanks so much.